My name is Joe McKnight, and I am delighted to be the pastor of Mission Bible Church. My father was the pastor of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Dublin, Maryland. My mom and dad both started Hartford Christian School in 1966 because of the removal of prayer and Bible reading from the public school system. And so I grew up in a Christian home. I have never spent a day in a public school. My dad was an amazing role model, amazing pastor. He was my pastor as well as my father and my mentor. And even today, sometimes something would happen, I think, well, I'd love to call Dad, because he would know exactly how to handle this situation. So it was a real education for me, growing up in a pastor's home, and seeing how Dad handled situations and learning from his example. Growing up in a pastor's home, you see both the good and the bad of the ministry. You see your father when he's very encouraged and when he's very discouraged. You know things that are going on in the congregation that probably a kid shouldn't, but because you're in the home, you do to some degree. My interest in missions began actually when I was about 6 years old. My family's home was where anybody that came through the church stayed. And so the missionaries stayed in my home. And I remember being just fascinated with missionaries. And when one would stay in our home, I would probably pester them too much, asking them questions. My dad went on missions trips and he would come back talking about them. When I was about 13 years old, I was in a Christian camp, a Christian youth camp in Georgia. And I remember the one evening, there was nothing said about missions at all, but I was strongly impressed in my spirit that God wanted me to be a missionary. And that night I went forward when they asked if anyone would like to come forward and pray. And I dedicated my life to be a missionary that night. So how I knew I was to be a missionary really was finalized as a senior in high school when a mission group was going from Hartford Christian School to Jamaica to conduct a week of vacation Bible schools over the Easter break. And I was not going with the group. I was busy, I was playing sports, I was in the senior play, and I just didn't have time to go on a missions trip. So the group had been raising their money for probably most of the school year to have the funds to go on this trip. And about 2 weeks before the trip was to go, my mom said to me, he said, "Joe, why don't you go on that trip?" Because they did need one more person. And my excuse was, well, I don't have the money because they've raised money all year. You never, ever use that excuse with God, because if he wants something done, he'll pay for it. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And so long story short, in less than a week, I had all the money needed to pay for my trip, plus some excess that had been given that actually was applied to some of the kids that had been raising money all year long. I remember going to get a haircut for that trip. And I went to the barber shop, and it probably was one of the first times that all by myself I witnessed to somebody. I witnessed to the barber that day. I guess God was dealing in my heart leading up to that trip to Jamaica. And I remember as I looked out the window of the plane, the first time I ever saw the island of Jamaica, and I just became immediately convinced that my life and that nation were somehow going to be linked. That this, in some ways, it felt like I was coming home for the first time in my life, even though I'd never been there before. That week was very transformative. It turned me back to a commitment I made to the Lord when I was 13. I had kind of gotten my own ambition and ideas along the way, and had mapped out a life for myself that was other than what God had ordained for me. When I got to college in the fall, the first thing I did was change my major, from pre-law to pastoral studies. Penny and I always say we met when her old boyfriend introduced us. But really how we met was through an organization on campus called Mission Prayer Band. That's where we got to know each other. Mission Prayer Band was a group that would meet after supper each evening and pray for missionaries. The thing that impressed me about Penny, I had made a vow with the Lord that I would not date any girl seriously that wasn't at least willing to go to the mission field, because I knew God had called me to missions, and I couldn't get emotionally involved with someone who could be a hindrance to that. So I told her, I said, well, Penny, I want you to know that I've made a vow with the Lord that I can't date anyone seriously that's not at least willing to go to the mission field, because I can't get entangled that way. And she smiled. She said, I've made the same vow. So that was a real, one of those, wow, God, what's this moments, here's someone else who has that same heart and burden and commitment to serving the Lord above relationships. There's a lot of competition in that field, but I persevered, and the Lord brought us together. There was a lot of providence in leading me to Jamaica. We were not planning to be on the field for another 2 years, so we were going to raise our support. And I was working on a master's degree at that time that I was going to finish. And we got a call from the mission board, and they said, how soon can you get there? Most missionaries take 2 to 5 years to raise their mission support. Penny and I started traveling every weekend immediately. And we raised our support. God raised our support in 6 months, which that's just unheard of with missionaries. So we basically went from, we're going to be there in 2 to 5 years, to 6 months, the money's come in and we're going. And so that was a very clear indication from God that He was in this, that He was going to pay for it. And when we went to Jamaica, we had enough money for 1 month. And we were there for 16 and a half years and never ran short once. God always supplied exceeding abundantly above all that we could ask or think. When we were in Jamaica, we had a very, very busy preaching schedule. There was a time when we would have Sunday school in the morning at what we called the Crowder Church, which was the base church right in front of our house, and then morning worship there. And then we would go back in, grab some lunch. We would head from there over to Pegaberry, which was actually to Belle Isle, excuse me, I still get it confused, over to Belle Isle to a community center, and we would have a youth meeting there with some children and teenagers. We would go down to Smithfield. We'd have an evening worship service, followed by another Sunday school, and then we would come back to the base church and have an evening service. They would begin the song service without us, and I basically would get there and go right into the pulpit. So there were times, not counting the work in Little London, when we would have 7 services or 9 services a day, when you count the Sunday schools and Bible clubs. We were right out of college, 2 very small kids, and a lot of youthful energy. But it was a pretty busy schedule. Every missionary faces challenges. One that's kind of surprising, I believe, to most people, is that the greatest challenge that a missionary faces often is just simply living on a mission field. In Jamaica, you have to go to 5, 6, 7 stores to find what you need. You buy your vegetables and your meat in the open market. And so it takes all day long just to get a few things. Just getting around, the roads are full of potholes. The next big challenge is the cultural transfer. A very seasoned missionary, a missionary that had been on the field, been in Suriname actually for 20 some years, said to me one day, he said, you only understand as much of a culture as the people are willing to let you understand. And it's very easy to offend people unintentionally. I announced that we were going to have revival services at one of the churches. To my upbringing, a revival service basically was an evangelistic crusade. What I found out was that in that culture, revival was charismatic. And so when a church was going to have a revival, what the Jamaican people understood was they were going to be speaking in tongues, there was going to be somebody come in and do healings, and they were going to sacrifice a goat. I mean, it was going to be a big deal. And so I was announcing that we're going to have revival, and some of the older folks were saying, Pastor, we don't want revival. And what do you mean we don't want revival? And then they started explaining to me what the local cultural understanding of revival was. It was very different. So that's the kind of thing that you can't learn from your classes in college. And then another situation, we were having a youth meeting at one of the churches, and we had a bag of candy, and the kids were all kind of mobbing me for candy. So I just started throwing the candy, and the kids picked it up. Next Sunday, when it came time for the youth meeting, there was no one. It was empty, just one or two kids. And we start asking around, come to find out I had offended the entire village because I made their children get candy like pigs. And so I had to go around to all the houses in the whole village, whole community, and apologize to the families, that I wasn't trying to insult their children. I was trying to do something nice for them, but I just did not understand their culture. And so that's the kind of challenges that a missionary faces. When Penny and I went to Jamaica, we had great plans of what we were going to accomplish. So I went as a very naive, energetic college graduate, and my big plan was we were going to get 10 young guys that were called to preach, and we were going to start a new church every year and leave one of them there, and we were going to set the world on fire, as they say. The reality was that out of the 16 and a half years, God gave us 2 young men that came along during our years who today are still faithfully pastoring churches. And the Lord will do His work in spite of us. He'll use us for His glory, but He will do His work. And so, as God said, my ways are not your ways, and your thoughts are not my thoughts. So you have to go into a ministry with ambition and plans and dreams, but at the same time, you have to be willing to say, Lord, not my will, but thy will be done. God calls His own elect and saves them. And as the disciples said, are there few that be saved? And I spoke with another missionary from Jamaica, and in our discussion, talking, he mentioned one young fella in the church that he had pastored for 13 years that still today is going on and serving the Lord. And he made the comment, if that one young fella was all there was for 13 years, then it was all worth it. And I feel that exactly, because there's 2 today that grew out of the ministry that Penny and I had, and it was all worth it. When Penny and I went to Jamaica, our thinking was we would be there our entire lives. And yet obviously we did leave. There were several factors. It was coming up on my oldest son's senior year of high school, and we really wanted him to graduate in the States. The good friend whose missionary I mentioned was taken from us. His health broke, and he had to leave and go back to the States. I got to be good friends with the director of the Jamaica Livestock Association, and he was able to supply me with things that I couldn't get otherwise. He got sick and went to Florida for treatment. My grocer that I used week after week, his wife got cancer. They went to Florida for treatment. A fellow who owned a area called Paradise Park, who let us use his facilities for having youth retreats and things, he died suddenly with a heart attack. We had a market lady, because when I went in the market, the price of everything skyrocketed, and I didn't know how much tomatoes cost, but we had this one lady that she would charge us the correct price for tomatoes and carrots and potatoes and guava and avocado and all the fruits. And if she didn't have what we needed, she would yell all the way across the public market, Brother Joe's coming, and he's buying onions from you, and you're going to charge him $2 a pound. So everybody knew, nope, you can't charge him more than you should. So long story short, Patsy, my market lady, died at 43 years old, sudden heart attack. And we had relied on her for almost the entire time. When we bought vegetables for our summer camps, we went to her. She was taken away. So the Lord started taking away those key pieces, and at the same time, I really was in a cold spot of ministry, and I began to pray, Lord, what is happening here? And at the same time, the Russian space station, this dates us a few years, but the Russian space station had gone out of contact. And I read in the news that they said that the Russian space station would continue on the last command it had inevitably. And I thought, wow, Lord, that's where I am. I know you sent me here, but I'm still just circling, ministering on that last command, but I need a new command. I need to know what to do next. And it was through that multitude of circumstances that we began to realize, the Lord is leading us away from here. At the same time, we had a minor disagreement with the mission board over the future of the ministry. We approached the board and said we would like to start, being based in Jamaica, but visiting some of these other countries and have a broader ministry and use the skills that we've learned in Jamaica to expand the mission. And that idea was just flatly rejected. Penny and I resigned from the board effective 6 months from then. And we went back to Jamaica for 6 months and settled up our affairs and sold out and came back. We had been on the front line, for 16 and a half years. We had had a lot of heartaches and a lot of joys along the way, and God had to refit us. It was time to step back. I did not realize it at the time, but looking back, I was not in a place where I was ready to get up and preach. In fact, I was asked to do a men's retreat about 6 months after we got back from a church that had been a supporting church, wonderful people. I couldn't do it. I needed to be preached to. I needed to sit and be. We had graduated college and gone in full force, and I needed to be fed for a while. I was just worn out.
I first met Pastor McKnight at a troublesome elder's house. There wasn't anything in particular that stood out. It was, he was an individual there. I appreciated his good pastoral Christian demeanor. I have helped start several church plants, been blessed of the Lord to be able to do that. We came across a group of people in the mall who were just having Bible readings. I ended up praying with them. They were very ecstatic to hear the prayer. They consolidated all their little home Bible studies at different people's places, and before I knew it, we had 40 to 70 people circulating through our home. We petitioned the congregation we were at the time, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, for support. They agreed. We started Trinity Reformed Church, Gaithersburg. That blew up when, after we selected a pastor, he declared that he didn't believe that all the canon of Scripture was in fact canon. He cast doubt on the book of Mark and other passages. So we were just reeling right after we had selected this individual. It just blew the whole thing up. We immediately lost a lot of people. Yeah, it just didn't end well. It was very painful. I had to punch out earlier than I wanted. The sheep were scattered, and it was just a huge mess. And so I had zero interest in restarting any kind of church activity, church planning. And then we came into a congregation known as Pilgrim Presbyterian Bible Church in Bel Air. Didn't want to go there, it was too far. I went there, fell in love with Pastor Bird. He understood the battles and the challenges I had been through. Finally, I found somebody who understands the issue with the canon.
I remember saying to my wife one time, wow, after meeting Vince and his family, maybe there are 7,000 people that haven't bowed the knee to Baal in Baltimore. I don't know. You get so disillusioned with what's going on in the world. I just felt we were kindred spirits after talking to him. He loved Reformed theology, King James Bible version. He loved singing the old hymns and the Psalms. So there was just a connection made immediately. I had 6 years in the Marine Corps, 4 years active. I had 23 months in Vietnam, most of that in combat units, all of them. I lost a lot of people. My captain was killed, the sergeant in my tent was killed, a couple of the guys were killed. Some, I saw them die. I did a lot of medevacs where guys I didn't know, they were wounded or dying. I didn't know them. I mean, I saw a lot of stuff. Got shot at a lot. I had a sniper zone in me one time, just missed me. I saw a lot of stuff. Pastoring a church was harder. I will say that. People thought, how do you put up with what you put up with? How do you keep that church going? I guess it was because you're in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps didn't prepare me for the spiritual warfare, the difficulty that you run into with people. Just didn't. I'd rather deal with a couple of drunk Marines and a couple of angry supposed Christians. You know, those were tougher times. I tried to be a pastor more than a preacher. I felt that the people can listen on the radio, and especially today with sermon audio, but not many pastors go out and visit and talk with the people and get down and weep with them.
When we came back from Jamaica, it was a hard time because Penny and I had been in ministry, nonstop, and God had to refit us. God had to reteach me that His will is not always my will, that I had to submit to what He wanted rather than pushing ahead with what I wanted. But above all, I needed to be preached to. I needed to sit in the pew and have the Word of God preached to me. And you think about Elijah on the mountain. Elijah on the mountain had just seen a great victory. The prophets of Baal have been slain. Fire has fallen from heaven and has burned up the water and the stones alike. But then Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you. And you find Elijah out hiding in a cave saying, Lord, take my life from me. And I think a lot of pastors and missionaries get to that point where they say, Lord, it's enough now, O Lord. I can't take any more. God's response was not to judge Elijah for that. Rather, God's response, Elijah prayed to die, and God gave him what he needed to live. God gave him a cruse of oil and some water and some bread and sleep. And he rose, and there's some more water and there's some more bread and sleep. But then he went in the strength of that meat 40 days and 40 nights until he came to the mountain of God. And I've thought about that a lot. That's kind of where we were when we came back from Jamaica. We needed, just like a unit that had been in battle, God needed to refit us, to re-equip us for the next ministry, the next battle He'd have for us.
Like as a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear Him. For He knoweth our frame. He remembereth that we are dust. As for man, his days are as grass, as the flower of the field, so he flourisheth. For the wind passeth over it, and it is gone, and the place thereof shall know it no more. But the mercy of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting upon them that fear Him, and His righteousness unto children's children.
I worked in various jobs. I installed appliances for a few months. I restored a house for a friend of mine. I sold cars for about a year and a half, worked at a Chevrolet dealership. And at the same time, a church that I knew of up near Philadelphia was without a pastor. And so they were looking for people to fill in. And I said, yeah, sure, I can go up there. So I would go one Sunday a month. And that by the second or third month, that became 2 Sundays a month. And by about the 6th month, I was there every week. And, Penny and I prayed about it. And finally talked with the elder of the church and said, if you are interested in me becoming your full-time pastor, I'm willing to do that. And I really figured I would just keep working a job, and because it was a very small church, they would have 10, 15 people on Sunday morning. The church met and said, we want you to be our pastor, and we want you to be full-time. So I resigned from the car dealership and went into full-time pastor there. And I pastored there for almost 6 years. The years we spent at Marcus Hook Bible Presbyterian was really our first introduction to the Bible Presbyterian churches. It was exciting for me to finally be among a denomination where the doctrines of grace were fully embraced and subscribed to. When I was in Jamaica and it was coming towards the end of the time there, I got into a situation where I knew I was doing what the Lord had told me to do, but I didn't have any clear direction for the future. And I got into a situation very similar to that at Marcus Hook, where I was preaching every week. I was doing prayer meeting, I was teaching Sunday school, And I had liberty to preach. I knew I was supposed to be there. And yet that burden for the future, what's the next step? That was not there. Pastor Keith was aging. He had had a major heart attack, and he knew that the day was coming when he was going to have to step down. He could not continue.
I was over 70. I'd had 3 heart attacks. My wife had struggling with her own health issues. And the Lord just leaned on me that it was time for someone to come in younger who would have the exuberance. I found, and the church liked, Pastor Joe McKnight.
Pastor Bird and I have known of each other for many, many years. The first time that he and I really had fellowship together was actually at a Bob Jones University alumni luncheon when Dr. Bob Jr. was preaching. Keith and I were sitting there, and we're probably the only ones that are Reformed in the room, that really subscribe to the doctrines of grace. And Dr. Bob Jr. is speaking, and he said, fellas, the older I get, the more of a Presbyterian I become. And started talking about the doctrines of grace. And Pastor Keith and I are just kind of looking at each other like, wow, that sounds good. We haven't heard that from one of the Joneses before. But that's really where we became close friends. He had contacted me and said, would you consider coming to Pilgrim? So I told him, well, Keith, I know God put me at Marcus Hook. I can't abandon my post. I cannot leave until God gives me permission to leave like he did in Jamaica. A few months later, Pastor Keith asked me again, will you come to Pilgrim? And I gave him the same answer. I said, I'm flattered that you would ask, but I cannot abandon my post. And probably close to a year and a half after the first time he asked me that, he asked again. And my answer was largely the same, but I told him I'll pray about it. Because if another man of God 3 times has approached me and feels like the Lord is laying on his heart that this is what the future should be for his ministry, then I cannot just say, no, I'm not doing it. I've got to pray about it. And so I began to pray about it. And Penny was very leery of making the move. But after praying about it, I became more and more convinced, this is what the Lord would have.
Pastor Bird retired, and then Pastor McKnight was brought on board, and I was ecstatic that he was there. He was very solid on the doctrines of grace. He was very solid on what the canon of Scripture was, and he was also very solid in 6 days of creation. Those are 3 very difficult things to get together in one package. He could also preach well. Frankly, of all the different ministers I had seen come through that presbytery, I was impressed with him the most.
When I came to Pilgrim, I came for life. That's the way I've approached every ministry that I've gone into. I've approached it with a mindset that this is not temporary. I came into Pilgrim thankful that Pastor Keith was still there and requested of the congregational meeting that he be retained for the advice of the congregation, and they voted on that and agreed that he would be part of the session. So I came fully expecting to be there for the rest of my life, the rest of my ministry, and praying that it would grow and prosper. And I, from the first week I was there, carried a little laminated card in my billfold with the name, every family name, and if they had children attending, all the children's names. I carried that in my pocket constantly, and it was my prayer card. I pulled it out every day and prayed through that entire list, because I was there, and the Lord had other plans.
Pastor Bird started to really warm my heart, and then Pastor McKnight, I was beginning to be very encouraged by. I was very encouraged by his demeanor towards me. He was very respectful. Finally, here's a pastor that didn't feel threatened by somebody who knew the Bible well and could teach, because I'd been doing it for a while. Look, I didn't go to seminary. I don't have a certificate. I just got excited about Jesus when God saved me a long time ago, and my mouth hadn't been stopped shut since then. But strangely enough, there's not a lot of ministers that are, yoo-hoo, hey, here's a guy that can teach the Bible and he hadn't gone to our school. There's not a lot of ministers that are happy about that. And Joe was accepting of that.
When I got there, the church started growing. New families, a few new families had come, and some of the old folks didn't quite like that, which that was concerning to me, that they felt like, well, you know, the church is changing personalities because all these new people are coming in.
That church was growing. You had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 families that began to appear at Pilgrim. I've never seen such kind of church growth.
The church at Pilgrim had gone through a tremendous trial before I got there. There had been a move from an elder to try to remove Pastor Keith, a move that failed. But it had caused fractures within the congregation. When there's already cracks, it's easier to widen a crack than it is to heal a crack. And so we were kind of dealing with that from the start, trying to keep everybody happy, and you can never keep everybody happy. There were people there who didn't really want to talk with other people there. In other words, you know, even within the congregation, there were some people that had their group of friends and they didn't like somebody that sat on the other side of the church.
People that were once warm and huggy to Angela and I no longer were warm and huggy to Angela and I, wouldn't even talk to us, wouldn't come up afterwards. I mean, there was an immediate parting and a division.
There were a few individuals in particular who went about as busybodies. You know, I say that with Christian charity, but reality. So I was combating with that and trying to work with it, and met with several people in the office, along with the other elder, trying to keep peace and work through situations and appease people. But there was dissension over whether the flowers should be on the communion table or on a table beside communion table. And if the flowers were on the communion table, should the Bible be in the middle, or can the flowers be in the middle in the Bible? Just that kind of ongoing things, arguments over sofas.
Another word I heard that got back to me was, well, we have to protect our church. That's such a telling statement that came from that church officer, because it really betrays a lot of thinking. Our church. It had no longer become Christ Church, but it was their club. And that is easy for a church to become a club. And so the chief complaints, you're messing up our club.
The divisions in the congregation really, when it came to a head, I was on vacation for 2 weeks after my daughter's wedding. And when we got back, we realized that there had been a lot of chatter and talk going on. And the elder had actually met in his home with 3 or 4 families that were disgruntled. That seems to happen a lot, you know, while the pastor's away is when people really start sharpening their arrows.
From time to time, he would reach out and speak to me and say, you know, are you aware of what's going on? So he began to trust me more, and I began to grow closer to him. We prayed together more often, and I heard in his prayers a man whose heart was truly aimed at the things of God. He was sincere, and I couldn't get around. He was the real deal. There was nothing fake about it. I wasn't abandoning Joe. I wasn't. I was there for him, and I knew that was helpful. I knew that was helpful because when I had the same kind of issues from the former church explosion, I was looking for an ear. You're looking for somebody that has gone through that same set of circumstances with you. You need to have a sympathetic voice there at your side to lean on. I felt that. I would be waiting anxiously by my phone to hear a call from 1 or 2 of the core sheep members of Trinity Gaithersburg, just so I can hear from my brothers. Are they still with me? Are they still on the same page, or has everybody abandoned me? He and I were beginning to become very good friends.
I was informed that they would like to have a vote on whether to retain me as pastor or to release me. I packed up and left the church building, drove to my father's grave, and stood there and prayed for Pilgrim for probably half an hour. I was not talking to my father. My dad's not there. But my father was my pastor in this life. And so I went to that place to pray and cried, prayed it through. Lord, thy will be done. You brought me here. It is your prerogative to move me if that be your will.
These dissenters began to call for a revote somewhere around the summer. I think they got fed up with Pastor. At the previous congregational meeting to approve the church budget, there was great vehement displeasure at his performance, and I made a motion, okay, let's just forgo a salary increase. Sorry, brother. Because, and he agreed with me later as well. You don't want to tip the apple cart coming in the door. That was his first year in. And let's just work through these issues. Let's settle it out. Let's kind of talk and let's address and smooth things. Then, somewhere in the summer, some very carefully worded statements began to come from the pulpit saying there will be a congregational meeting for a vote on the office of the preaching pastor. And that was a strange thing because they were making a vote on the office, not the person, the office. The office is the chair, the position, the seat of authority that someone sits in, not the person. So it sounds like they were trying to adjust that. Well, at that point, Pastor Joe and I were talking, and he says, oh no, this is about me. They're trying to get rid of me. They eventually called for a meeting on a Wednesday in the middle of the week, otherwise would have been a Wednesday prayer meeting. It was a Wednesday butcher meeting. That was right after Memorial Day, Labor Day, September, Labor Day in 2019.
The handwriting was on the wall. It was a situation where we had counted the votes mentally and knew that it was very unlikely. If I stayed at Pilgrim, it would be by one vote, and most likely the ones that voted against me would not stay.
Labor Day Monday in September, it happened to be a holiday, perfect timing. 2 days before the meeting, we got together at the Bensel house. We got together with the Kolyabins, Anton and Yvonne. Neither were married yet. We got together with Pastor Joe and myself. So that was just the handful of people that were there. We all agreed we want it to go well. We don't want Pastor McKnight kicked out. We want to stay at Pilgrim. But we also agreed that it might not go well. And if it doesn't go well, what are we going to do? We said, well, we could go to Reformation Bible Church, Reverend John McKnight, Pastor Joe's brother, just up the street. But that would have been an unreachable distance for many of the flock. We said, well, could we do something ourselves? And we agreed that we could meet at the Bensel house. God had been preparing them. Lord, how can we use our house? And that's a whole story there. How can we use our house to the glory of God? Well, this was a way they could do it. They could host church services. They had a piano, we had a pianist. Edward was technical, he had bandwidth, it was great. We could stream from his place. He had providentially just gotten a bunch of chairs from the school system, so he had a bunch of chairs he could put in his house. I mean, it was wonderful. Brother Yvonne had just graduated from college. Guess what? With a degree in finance and accounting. Hey, we have a treasurer, that's great. I know something about administration starting up, bulletin, order of service. I also had a bunch of hymnals. I'd already had them purchased. Hey, that's great. Joe could preach, obviously. So we agreed that if something should happen, we will meet at the Bensel house. We will email such and such. We'll have a bulletin. Who does what? We're ready to get started. And so we made kind of a bootstrap plan that if, God forbid, it fell to pieces, we would activate it. And none of us wanted to. The meeting came. I thought Pastor McKnight had all of his ducks in a row. I thought all the evidence was clear. I thought all the accusations that could possibly be brought up would be false and could be shown to be false. I thought the presbytery would do right. Yeah, none of that happened. It was a railroad job if you've ever seen one. I mean, it was just, we're here to chop Joe's head off, and the sooner we can get his head to the chopping block, the better. I was very impressed at the response of the wives. Penny nobly stood up and defended her husband. They even attacked Pastor Bird. Miss Livy nobly stood up and defended him. The meeting was led by a presbyter who was not following any recognized rules of order other than his own setup, where you had one chance to speak and that was it. I asked a procedural question. That was considered my only chance to speak. Others donated their time to me to speak. I had a prepared statement.
The Lord just gave me a calmness and a peace through that. I tend to, want to speak up and be very defensive, but the Lord gave grace that night. That was a real blessing to me.
The fix was in. They didn't want him. They were going to do whatever they had to, and so Some walked out of the meeting crying. That following Sunday, others met and they were shocked. What just happened? Because 2/3 of the congregation was no longer there.
I had a lot of people that came along and said, we're praying for you, and it's going to be all right. We're not going to leave you without an income and without a home. We'll be sure you're taken care of. And so there was the faithful few, which basically was the nucleus of Mission Bible Church, that stood with me and prayed for me.
I told Angela, I said, we see all this nonsense coming down. We don't have a dog in this fight, but it's totally unjust to him. And I stood with him because I saw a man who was a legitimate bona fide pastor and was an effective gospel minister. And I happen to have the skills, the knowledge, the wherewithal, the time, at this point I'm retired, to help a minister in a true and meaningful way. And I was just Holy Ghost 100% committed, saying, this man is not going to go driving a bus on my watch. I'll do whatever I got to do to make sure that he doesn't get out of the pulpit. That cannot happen. And I felt a little bit like Esther. Maybe I've been brought for such a time as this. I couldn't see myself standing before Jesus Christ with a fat bank account and a fishing rod in my hand on a boat in the middle of the lake saying, I don't want to be troubled with that. I'd rather have fun. I just couldn't see myself doing that and saying and giving an account to the Lord God to say, I just let it fall because it just looked like it'd be too much headache. It wasn't even a choice. I said, no, I can't let this man fall. Yeah, it just wasn't meant to be. I really wish it hadn't come to pass in the way that it did.
I covenanted with the Lord when that happened that I wouldn't get bitter, that I would just accept it, that I would take it. And so I covenanted with the Lord that I would never pray judgment on those that have voted me out, and I have not. But I still pray for Pilgrim Presbyterian Bible Church. Many Sunday mornings I will pray for them. I will pray for their elder. I will pray for whoever's preaching there. I'll pray for the individuals that I know are still there. I still love those people, and I always will. It doesn't really matter what happened. I still pray for them. I was voted out on a Wednesday night, and Mission Bible Church met for the first time without a name the following Sunday.
The start of NBC was so unique because there was so much that had been long in preparation. And lo and behold, it all came together very quickly. I'd already been reaching out to those who knew me, who trusted me, and let them know that there's something happening, something afoot. We have a plan. If it fails, we're going to meet at the Bensel House such and such a time. Others I didn't know, but I was beginning to develop a relationship with them.
I definitely wanted what we were doing to grow into a church. I was very willing to preach for this little group that was starting a new church on the weekends, but I expected to be, earning a living in the secular world. However, Brother Vince and the other men right away said, no, we think we should pay you a salary. And Vince went to work on it, put together a budget. The first Sunday, people were hurting. It was a group of sheep that were scared. Christ said to the disciples, referring to himself, smite the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. There was an excitement. There was that sense of fresh and new. There was a relief that the tensions were gone, but there was a little bit of trepidation. Okay, what's next? What are we going to do? And yet there was a lot of joy. There was just a rejoicing. It was a wonderful, rejoicing service.
The first Sunday we met at the Bensel House was jubilant. It kind of set the tone and the pace for all the other meetings at Mission Bible Church every Sunday thereafter, but it was particularly jubilant and joyful. You're wondering who's going to come through the door, right? Who is with you? Who's with you in this cause? Who believes that what has happened to Joe was grievously wrong, and who says, no, I'm going to take a stand for truth? I knew for me, I wasn't about to let Joe fall, but who else felt that way? The Bird family, the Kolyabin brothers, Marissa, the Lloyds, the Hans, the Seilers, the Bensels, the Kluths certainly did. Chris Wine was there, Miss Saba was there. We were all on the same mind, same accord.
Mission Bible Church has been earnest in worship from the very beginning and in singing praises. And that was that first Sunday. It was an exciting service. It was a wonderful atmosphere.
It was exciting. It was like old home week. It was, back clapping, handshaking, chest bumping. It was just a really exciting time for us. It really was. It is, I would say, then and today, probably the warmest, most enjoyable climate of any church we've ever attended, Mission Bible Church. For me, it's been great. And Livy, my wife, we love it.
I've often thought of Pastor Keith and Miss Livy, who had poured their whole ministry. That's the only church Pastor Keith ever pastored. They had poured their whole ministry into it from the time it met in their home for prayer meeting and in the elementary school in Kingsville, through the purchasing of that building. I remember Pastor Keith showing me the building while they were still meeting in the gymnasium of the elementary school. He showed me the property where the building was going to be built. It was just overgrown woods. There was nothing there yet, but he was so delighted to show me where they were going to build. And so it had to be hardest for them than for anyone, because he had seen the ministry that he had given his whole life to crumble.
My wife and I, we were involved with the planning of the Pilgrim Presbyterian Bible Church. And that went for 35 years. It was healthy, it was vibrant, it was reformed. We felt that we'd really accomplished something. We were really very happy that the Lord had used us. Things did not go as often. It's really hard when you've been a pastor for 35 years for anyone to come in and fill the same shoes. I've known a lot of churches where the pastor was there 25, 50 years in one case, and the first replacement pastor isn't the old pastor. People get dissatisfied. We were fortunate when we left to discover that Mission Bible Church was just forming. To come to Mission Bible Church, our first Sunday there was like, wow. It just seemed like the greatest place to retire my ministry, and yet still be used from time to time, and to fellowship with people that were really, really serious about the scriptures.
There was one good thing that came out of the Presbyterian Church, and that's the phrase, the minister should be free of worldly care. And I view that as the great duty and the great privilege. Keep him free from all the administrative junk. And there's plenty of it. I'm the offensive line, he's the quarterback, right? I got to keep all this junk. And if you can give the quarterback plenty of time to do his job, he can connect with somebody downstream.
My life verse is the one I quote all the time. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is tried. He is a buckler to all those that trust in him. God doesn't make mistakes. God doesn't do things wrong. The departure from Pilgrim was extremely painful, and it still is. It always will be. There will always be a wound there, but God has given us beauty for ashes. God has taken that tragedy and heartbreak and made it into the most joyous, blessed ministry I've ever had. It's wonderful to preach and know that no one is sitting there picking the sermon apart, and no one's going to have roast preacher for lunch. As they say, that the congregation's here because they're hungry for the Word of God. And if I simply open the book and read, they're going to be right there with me and be blessed. I don't have to have a fancy sermon with flowery words to tickle ears. Just preach the Word of God, and God's people come hungry week after week after week. We have a diaconal fund, which is available to help folks that have a need. We give heavily to missions through our thank offering. We are able to provide for special meals for the congregation to be catered. My salary is paid in full, and actually the salary that Mission Bible Church started me with as a church plant was the exact salary that I'd had at Pilgrim. It was cent for cent. There, like Christ said to the disciples, when I sent you out without purse and scrip, lacked ye anything? And they said nothing. God has supplied every need, exceeding abundantly above all that we can ask or think.